Hello, and welcome to my channel. My name is Jonathan Cohn, and today I have another edition of All My Books, this time featuring one of my favorite fantasy science fiction authors, David Farland, also known as Dave Wolverton. I talk a lot about David Farland, so I won't go too much into his life here, but to suffice to say, he started out as a science fiction writer in the late 80s, early 90s, wrote some great science fiction novels, including some tie-in books for Star Wars. He wrote The Courtship of Princess Leia, and he wrote a tie-in book for Episode 1. And so then he eventually, around the late 90s, decided to rebrand himself, and so he dropped the name Dave Wolverton for his books and took up the name David Farland in order to promote his fantasy books that he was going to start. And he was most famous for starting the Runelords series, and he also was a teacher at BYU. He taught famous authors like Brandon Sanderson, Brandon Mull, and Dan Wells, and a huge array of other authors. And then he eventually slowed down his writing in the late 2000s, and in the 2010s, and focused on being a teacher, focused not necessarily in the schools, but starting his own writing conferences and his own writing workshops that he did with his family and with some other writers. And he was a superb writer, and unfortunately, he tragically passed away in January of 2022. He was still not that old. He was in his 60s. It was a very sad day for the entire community, and we are awaiting his last novel if it ever comes out. He was working on it. His estate's working on it. We'll see if it ever actually comes out. But in the meantime, I have my collection that I'd want to do. Now, if you are a collector, let me know what kinds of books you have of him. I've done these types of collections for. I've done one for Kevin J. Anderson, for Timothy Zahn, for Michael Stackpole, for a bunch of other authors. And so this is my opportunity to talk about my David Farland collection. And this is a very interesting collection because I have a lot of copies of his Runelords books because I'm a big fan. I cannot overemphasize how much a fan I am of his Runelords books. It is my second favorite fantasy series, but my first favorite fantasy series, which is The Wheel of Time, is way too hard to collect. I do not have the financial ability or the time, or really it's just hard to collect original Wheel of Time hardcovers and to get all the different editions because they keep producing new editions. Whereas the Runelords, they're not as in demand, so they're not as expensive. They also aren't printing as many copies, so it's not as hard to get all the different editions. And lastly, I feel like it's a smaller series, and it also isn't as talked about, so it has more value to me. If I was a Wheel of Time collector, that's where a dime a dozen. But if you're a Runelords collector, you're in a special place. So, and I love Wheel of Time, as I said, it's my favorite series, and Runelords is my number 2. But let's go ahead and look at what my copies of David Farland. I'm going to start with his fantasy first and go through his Runelord stuff. Then I'm going to go into his sci-fi stuff under the pen name, actually his original name of Dave Wolverton. So the first book I have is a hardcover of the Runelords. Unfortunately, it came with a little bit of tear down here. This was a Christmas present from my parents, but I really wanted to have a hardcover edition, and this cover is just gorgeous. I love this cover, one of my favorite fantasy covers of all time. This is how you make a fantasy cover, where it's a full painting, where you can understand the magic system, you can understand that it's fantasy, you also get the vibe. This is a very elemental book series, and so you understand you have all the leaves, and then the leaves are forming a crown around this character. Just a terrific book, and it wraps around to the back, which is also beautiful. But this hardcover also has, and I don't know who did this and why they would do it, but they decided to put a barcode up here, but you have this beautiful interior cover, a la kind of like the Stormlight Archive books, which has, a painting of one of the giants. I believe they're called Froth Giants, and it's also the same on this back. I think they should have made it different images for each side, but it's okay. We still have images for it. So that's my hardcover of the first Runelords book. It was originally titled The Sum of All Men, but they changed it to be the title The Runelords, and I don't know if this was because they didn't want it to be confused with The Sum of All Fears, or if it was because they thought that The Runelords was a better title. I have not come across a single copy that has The Sum of All Men on the top, so I'm really interested in that publication reasoning. But that's that hardcover. Next, I have my hardcover edition of Brotherhood of the Wolf, but it is a much smaller edition. When you see them, you can see the differences, the size differences. And because the print's a little bit smaller on this one, this is the longest book in the series, but it's this little small format one. I still intend to find the traditional hardcover size, but for now I just have this kind of hardcover. And this was a very good book that I enjoyed when I first read it, and as I've thought about it over time, I've actually enjoyed it a lot more the more I think about it. Next I have the third book, Wizardborn, which I've put my protective covering on already. Beautiful cover. Oh man, I love this cover with the Froth Giant, and you have the Knights, and it's a wraparound on the back. I mean, this is just gorgeous. Darrell K. Sweet just knocked it out of the park. And this book is one of my favorites in the series, and it has the single best ending sequence of any book in this series, and really one of the best ending sequences of any fantasy series. The whole river sequence, if you've read it, you know what I mean. The river sequence towards the end, oh, so good. Next, the next book is Lair of Bones, and I have two hardcovers for this one. I have the small hardcover and the traditional size hardcover. When I was first collecting this series, I first was just looking for copies to buy, and I found almost all the books in paperback, except the fourth book, Lair of Bones, with which this book kind of ties up the first arc of books. I found this one only in this version, so I read it in this version, but I was like, you know what, I'm collecting all the paperbacks, so I eventually got the paperbacks, and then when I started collecting the hardcovers, I got the actual hardcover. This is probably the book I've found the most at bookstores. It's surprising how frequent this book is, despite the fact that it's book number 4. You'd think book number 1 would be the most frequent, because usually book number 1 is the most sold. Anyway, love this book. This is a book where I really didn't care for the ending originally, and now I think it's okay. It's not amazing, but I have both of these hardcovers. Next, I have my hardcover of the book Sons of the Oak, which is, again, a small hardcover. I am still looking for a large hardcover. This one and book 2, Brotherhood of the Wolf, are the only small hardcovers I have when I don't have the large hardcover, whereas I do have the small of Lair of Bones, but also the large, so I need to find the full-size hardcover of this one. But this is my least favorite Runelords book by a long shot. This is the one book that I think he misstepped. I think he made a major mistake with the publication of this book, and because of that, I haven't felt too eager to find a full hardcover of it. But because I love the series so much, and because I love David Farland as an author, I eventually do want to find it. Next, I have Worldbinder, which I ordered. I was going through my phase of reading through the Runelords, and I was like, I need to read it, and I need to find it. So I went online, I found a copy, and I said at ABE Books, and I said, buy it. And I bought it, and I put my protective covering over it, but it was all crinkled up, this cover, and it was just kind of grossish. And I've kind of smoothed it out a little bit, but you can still feel and see little crinkles in it. But it has this just standout cover. I usually don't like covers that are like set in darkness like this, but I think that this works super well. If you know this sequence in the book, this is towards the end of the book, you're like, that's a really good sequence. And then if you know the some of the background stuff, you're like, man, when you understand the background, this sequence takes a whole nother meaning. This is when I was like, man, the series is getting back on track. He's getting back into his groove after I felt he lost it with Sons of the Oak. So I really enjoyed Worldbinder, and I really like the cover. And the hardcover you can't really see, but Darrell K. Sweet made this amazing wraparound cover, and you can't see it on the hardcover because they blocked it out with the writing. And I'm all for writing, but if they had taken out the kind of blackness of it and just kept the white writing, you would have been able to see this beautiful wraparound cover. Anyway, just a little rant of mine. Then I have another book 7, The Wormling Horde, which, I'm going to be honest, cover is fine. It's the last Daryl K. Sweet cover, which is kind of sad. Again, Daryl K. Sweet had a penchant for drawing a very specific scene where I would be reading the book and I'm like, I am at that sequence. Like sometimes in fantasy books, they kind of go for the feeling of a scene rather than painting an exact sequence of a scene. I feel like, some of the Stormlight Archive books feel like you're getting the general idea, but not necessarily a specific word-for-word scene. This one, it is that way, as with most of the other books in the Runelords. Next, I have the final Runelords book currently published. We might get a future one, but the last one currently published called Chaos Bound. And this is the only book so far not done by Daryl K. Sweet. This was done by Kike Kotaki. Kike Kotaki. I apologize if I'm butchering your name. This book, I was like, book 7 was good, and even book 6 was good, but I'm like, but none of our OG cast was in it. And I was like, we need the OG cast back. And so he was like, all right, I'll bring back the OG cast. Yay! But the problem is, he brings them back in a way that you're not expecting, and so it's like, oh, I'm not so sure. But it's a good book. It's a good book, and it really sets up the finale well, and we haven't gotten the finale, but man, this book gives us a lot of setup towards the end. Very, very interesting ending. So those are my Runelords hardcovers, and I'm going to set them down while I get my next group, which my next one is Runelords Adjacent, and it is a hardcover. It is of Wizards of Wolves. Talked about it a lot recently on the channel. I just had a review recently. I just actually finished the book last night. It is a short story collection in memorial of David Farland, and all the short stories have to do with wizards and wolves. And they're all original short stories in their own universes or set in our universe, that type of thing. But there's the final short story in here is one of David Farland's short stories, Barbarians, which is set in the Runelords series, and it's a great short story. It's an amazing short story. It really made me think, I want a whole novel of this. And also is... it was published back in like 2013, but they finally reprinted it here. So I'm counting this as one of my David Farland books because it's all about David Farland. It's in memorial to him. So, and a gorgeous, gorgeous cover here. Next, I'll get into my Runelords paperbacks. I won't spend as much time because I've already talked about these hardcovers, but you have the Runelords, Brotherhood of the Wolf, which you can tell here is a massive book, the biggest book of the series. When you look at the hardcover, you'd never know. You'd think it's the same length as the others. Next, I have Wizardborn, which is like, on my definition of a tome, it just barely meets it. I say a tome is 500 pages. This book is 502. So it's like, whew, just under the wire, or over the wire, I should say. Then you have Lair of Bones, the paperback, which is unfortunately kind of torn up. The paperback of the Runelords, except for the top here, is pretty good. The paperback for Brotherhood of the Wolf, there's a little bit of tearage here, but it's not bad. This one, Wizardborn, it's almost, there is tearage, but you had no idea. Here, it's like, no, it's messed up. But it's a good book. And then I have Sons of the Oak, which still is in pretty good condition, and Worldbinder, which you can see the cover on the back a little bit better, but not as well as you should, because they covered it up with the writing here. Come on, guys. Always give deference to the cover. So I do not have books 7 and 8 in paperback. I am looking for them in local bookstores, but I'm not actively seeking out the paperbacks just because I'm spending my money on other things. It's like if I happen to see them, I'll get them. But at the moment, I'm not going to go currently searching out because I have other things to look up and read. So now I'm going to my science fiction books of David Farland under the name Dave Wolverton, which, by the way, I don't even have all his fantasy. There's still a lot of his fantasy books I haven't had collected, same with his science fiction, but I've collected quite a few. So the first thing I'll talk about is his Star Wars book. He wrote the Star Wars novel, The Courtship of Princess Leia, and it has I have two editions. I have the hardcover edition, which is this romantic, sweeping painting, and then you have the Courtship of Princess Leia paperback, which just looks like they're just trying to do the poster of Return of the Jedi. And there's a reason why they have the Rancor, and there's a reason why they're all dressed like that, and there's a reason they designed it like this. And in fact, the cover designer here is the same cover designer here, Drew Struzan. Drew Struzan did a lot of Star Wars art. He also did a lot for the movies posters. He also did a lot for book designs. He did some of the Timothy Zahn stuff in the 90s. Drew Struzan is just an amazing cover artist. So it's kind of funny that he did both of these, because I love this cover. This is a brilliant cover. This sets the tone, and this still has, you see the stormtroopers and the Empire and Han, and you have the guy who's from the other planet that's trying to win Leia's affection, all that stuff. It's a beautiful cover. And then you have this one, which I just think is ugly as a cover. I think that it puts them all in their Return of the Jedi garb, which is just not elegant. And I also think it's so drab and brown. And I'm like, why would you do this? Like, someone honestly thought this would market copies better. And this one wasn't the huge success that they wanted it to be, and I understand why. But did you really think this was a better cover? Really? I know it's all about selling copies, but come on, you have to have some self-respect. Speaking of self-respect, I will say I actually don't like the book. I'm a huge David Farland fan. I just spent the last 15 minutes gushing about his Runelords books. I love them so much. I think that The Courtship of Princess Leia is a misfire. I think that he didn't understand what the fans wanted, and I also don't think he understood the characters well enough. He understood the world building, and he understood the assignment that he was given, the assignment that the editors at Lucasfilm gave him. But when writing the characters and writing when he needed to write, I thought it was a misfire, not a good book. For comparison, I generally prefer the way the EU handled things, but there's an occasion where I prefer how the canon does things in Star Wars, and we just recently had a canon Star Wars novel that just came out called The Princess and the Scoundrel by Beth Revis, which also has a beautiful cover. And I read this and loved it, and it's kind of like everyone compares them, and it's like, I'm a big David Farland fan. I've only read 2 books by Beth Revis, so I'm not really a fan per se, but this one, Han and Leia, felt like Han and Leia. They felt like the decisions they had made in this book actually were decisions that the characters would make, whereas the decisions they make here just don't match up. So that's just me. So that's my Star Wars books by David Farland. Dave Wolverton. It's so hard when you do a name change like that. Also, he did one of the Jedi Apprentice series, the first in that book series with Jude Watson. I don't know why they didn't just have Jude Watson do the whole series. Maybe they thought that Wolverton would set the tone and also would be bigger names so he'd get bigger sales. I don't know what it was, but for some reason he did the first one, and I don't remember it being more great than the rest. It felt like the same, so that was a weird decision. Then I have the Golden Queen trilogy. I have the Golden Queen, which is, I have the second book, Beyond the Gate, and the third book, Lords of the Seventh Swarm. Beyond the Gate, I should have read it by the time this video airs, and Lords of the Seventh Swarm I should be reading in the next month or so. And I have read Golden Queen, and it is a cheesy, fun sci-fi book. I would say it's got the cheesiness that Willow has, but as a sci-fi, and it's got elements of fantasy in the world building. You could see how he was ready to make the transition to be a fantasy author, but it also has just bonkers science fiction elements to it as well. Bonkers science fiction. And of course you have kind of like that moon that's not the Death Star, and you have our main characters walking out, and the bear, which is hilarious. Definitely not Chewbacca, but the bear, who is very religious. This beautiful wraparound cover. I wonder who did the covers for these. Matt Stowicki. Anyway, so I love the cover art. It's so cheesy there. This one, it feels like they combined painting and Photoshop. Like the actual background is painting, and then they kind of did a little bit of Photoshop in there. Whereas this one, it feels like it's entirely a painting. And when you look at this, you're like, yeah, it's a science fiction book. And then you do the wraparound on this one. Boom, science fiction. If you didn't already know, it was science fiction. And apparently the paperback version of this book is different. Apparently this paperback has like a castle on it because they were trying to rebrand it as being more fantasy. But, oh man, that's just, look at that. Look at that. That is some science fiction right there. And I'm excited to read this. And then the third book, I'll be honest, this is the blandest of the three in terms of cover design. And of course I haven't read it, so I can't talk, about the book itself. And then it has the back cover, which is fine, but yeah, this is definitely the blandest of the three. So that is my David Farland science fiction collection. So you put them together, his science fiction, his fantasy, those are the books of his that I own. It's not all of them, but it is quite a lot of them. So if you've read David Farland, or Dave Wolverton as he's also known, which of his books are your favorites? Leave the comments down below for those. And which ones are your least favorites? And which copies do you own? Leave all those down below in the comments section. And until next time, I'm Jonathan, and thank you for watching.